I've been watching the talking heads on CNBC dissect what happened with Silicon Valley Bank and Signature Bank, and now what's happening with Credit Suisse. But Steve Eisman of The Big Short really stood out to me when he said this may not be 2008, but plenty of people are still going to lose money, and hopefully they're going to learn lessons. Now, history has shown us that most people don't learn lessons when bank failures happen or when countries turn on them. But I'm going to tell you who the actual winner is in all of these U.S. bank failures. So here's what's happened. In the course of about a week, 3 major U.S. banks failed, creating the second and third biggest bank failures in U.S. history. More bank failures that have happened in some countries' entire histories. Now, Credit Suisse is being called possibly too big to be saved rather than too big to fail, and has sunk to all-time lows on Swiss stock markets. No bank has yet to stand up and say, we want to buy Silicon Valley Bank in the United States, which is why the FDIC stepped in and said that we're going to basically make all the depositors whole. They're not calling it a bailout because they're not bailing out equity or bondholders, but they are giving people, including companies that had hundreds of millions of dollars in Silicon Valley Bank, their money back while they try and find a buyer. Basically, the FDIC, which has barely 1 penny to each dollar in deposits, has stepped in and taken charge. And yet a couple of days later, even as bank stocks are still wildly fluctuating in both the US and Europe, Janet Yellen, the Treasury Secretary, says, you know what, we're only going to do it when it's important. Basically telling you, hey, the money that funds bank deposit insurance may or may not benefit you. It may not be paid directly by taxes, but eventually the cost will come back to you, and we are going to decide who lives and who dies. In the UK, Silicon Valley Bank UK sold to HSBC, what we call the world's worst bank here, for a mere British pound. And their problem was basically risk without return, as Eisman called it. They had long-dated bonds. They didn't know how to necessarily lend all their money, so they bought bonds at the worst possible time, and then everything fell apart. Other banks in the U.S., there's been talk that even from former Democratic congressmen, maybe this bank was torpedoed. It was offered up as a sacrifice to get crypto out of the U.S. financial system. So there's a lot of talk about why all these banks are failing. But what we know is this contagion is spreading throughout. Stocks have crashed. Mid-sized banks have seen losses of 20, 30, even 60% in the course of a day or a week. Wild fluctuations, stocks going up and down. The market comes in and says, hey, we'll infuse some capital into this bank, whether it's government capital or whether it was recently JP Morgan Chase leading a consortium to pump capital into other banks that were at risk. Nobody seems to really care. The wild fluctuations continue. And so stocks crashed. People don't know if they're going to get their money. It seems like in this case, they may. But now you've created a sort of moral hazard, but with a great caveat of which banks are going to be saved and how do I play it? What I like is I've seen a few of the banks that we work with here for our business customers that are saying, okay, we're going to come in and we're going to 20x our FDIC coverage by using things like sweep accounts and having different accounts available to people. That's the way that the market should respond, rather than just having the government come in and pick winners and losers. But a lot of people are concerned which bank may have a problem next and what the government is going to just stick their finger in the air and decide to do today. The U.S. has so many banks and so many failures, and now you're seeing it spreading through Europe. Bank stocks in the UK, in France, in Spain, in other European markets have also experienced big drops, wild volatility. Now Credit Suisse back on the menu. It was being talked about as a problem last year. Now it appears to be, so says the media, in worse shape than ever. Now, Europe has long had banks that in some cases weren't in the best shape. What people on, like Steve Eisman said and other talking heads have said is, hey, many of the banks are not actually in terrible shape. Some of the U.S. banks are in the best shape that they have been in. But yet it's not helping. People don't feel good about the financial system. And I would imagine that's in part if you're paying attention because the government, again, just picks the winners and losers. But here's the winner, in my opinion. Places where banks have culturally, number one, been larger, been more conservative, and have been less niche. I've been telling you for years, and it's common knowledge among the expat community, that Hong Kong, not the worst place to set up your company. It may be for some people, it may not be for others. But the one thing that's been the case for years is that Hong Kong banks don't want your money. If you have a connection, I think we work with 1 or 2 banks that will open accounts, but you're just not going to go onto the street and go to a bank. You're certainly not going to go to the world's worst bank, HSBC, because they long ago de-risked all their accounts out of Hong Kong, even for Hong Kong companies. Even for people who work at their bank and have side hustle Hong Kong companies, they don't want their money. Now that's annoying, right? And it shows in our industry at Nomad Capitalist just how many of these one-size-fits-all service providers don't have a clue, because you'll see people who set up Hong Kong companies and they promise a bank account opening when the reality is you've got to go to other jurisdictions and you've got to know what you're doing outside of Hong Kong to open a bank account there. So that's a piece against the one-size-fits-all. But the good news of that is you have banks that don't need to desperately make loans to make money. You have banks in Asia that are more conservative, that are larger, and that have less niche where it's like, oh, we only serve Silicon Valley. We only serve the wine region. We only serve rich people in California. There is much less niche. And so for me, the winner in this situation has been Asia. Go and look at the stock market. You have seen some of the Singaporean banks, for example, seeing smaller gains over, let's say, a month. They have not really responded much at all to the issues that are happening in the US and that then spread to Europe. They've been relatively unaffected. Banks in China, banks that trade on the Hong Kong exchange have been largely unaffected or even gone up. They've basically sat there and yawned this off because they don't have the same exposure because, again, they're more conservative. And you look at the rankings of the best banks in the world, the safest banks in the world. I've looked at this every year for over a decade now. You'll see all the big banks in Singapore. You will see other banks in Asia. What you won't see is certainly many banks in the United States, and certainly the names of any banks you've heard of in the United States. You may see a few banks in Canada. There's separate issues there. You saw what happened last year when they decided, oh, if the government isn't like you, we may freeze your money for other reasons. The banks don't have to be safe for your money to be frozen there. And so the side effects in the US are that tech lost a partner, crypto's lost a partner, and Barney Frank, the former congressman who wrote Dodd-Frank, has said, yeah, you know what? It sounds to me like perhaps this happened to Signature Bank because they want to get rid of crypto in the US financial system. So tech is out, crypto is out. It shows that US banks aren't as safe as you thought they were, that you're basically dependent on FDIC charity if you keep more than $250,000. And so if I'm an investor, I already like, because I personally live a tax-friendly lifestyle, I already like bank stocks and other equities in Singapore, Hong Kong, places where there's no dividend tax and dividends are actually higher. I'm not here to give you investment advice, but I can tell you I've seen situations where you can double your dividend being in banks that are actually stronger because they pay a little bit higher dividend yield and they don't have a dividend tax that you'd pay if you lived in, let's say, the United States and invested in a US bank. But as a depositor, if I had to choose to keep $10 million in a bank, I'll choose a bank in Singapore that has more robust service, that's more conservative, that's more international, that lets me hold different currencies. If I want to dip in and out of, hey, I'm going to buy a property in Europe, let me buy euros at a great, conversion rate when the euro's at a low. I want to have that flexibility. I want to have that strength rather than keeping $10 million in a bank in the West where politicians are increasingly talking about using your bank account as a weapon against you. And on top of that, the strength of the institutions just isn't that good. So to me, the clear winner is Asia. Consistently, we've talked about Singapore, Hong Kong relatively up limits. I think Dubai and the UAE may play some role in this. I mean, they talked about in the global financial crisis. We're going to make sure everyone gets their money back. Not in particular banks, but in any bank. Because again, they don't have 10,000 banks there. All the banks are required to be public and be serious institutions, and we don't just have, community banks. And so the way that Asia runs their banking system to me makes more sense. And I think the results have somewhat been borne out. Obviously, Asians, bank stocks are going to have their own ups and downs. They're going to have their own issues. But for me, there's a lot more conservative approach. And I like to look at the root cause rather than symptoms. For me, the symptoms that you're seeing in the West could have been solved with the same root cause that Asia comes with, which is why, as a depositor, I definitely would favor keeping my money in Asia, and I'm definitely favoring having diversification where my money is never in one country, never in one currency. This is a wake-up call, even in Switzerland and certainly in the United States and Canada, that you might want to take a look at banks in other places like Asia. It's something that we help people do at Nomad Capitalist all the time. Beyond banking, what are the things do you need to do to protect your assets? Do you need a trust? Do you want to move your business offshore? Maybe you even need a second passport. Maybe having a residence in another country opens up new banks that wouldn't talk to non-residents, but if you're a resident, they will talk to you. If you buy a property that will appreciate faster or pay a higher yield, then they'll talk to you because you've got property, you've got a connection. There's lots of questions that go into this rather than just walking in, taking your coupon you got in the mail, and getting your free toaster half an hour later. Banking in Asia, because it's conservative, banking in anywhere that's conservative, is more laborious than that, and it's something that we help people navigate every day. But as the punchline says, it's harder because it's worth it.